Welcome to Music History Monday for May 20th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's podcast is A Difficult Life. If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. Before we get to the principal topic of today's post, we must note an operatic disaster that had nothing to do with singers or the opera being performed on stage. Rather, it was a disaster that inspired Gaston Leroux to write the novel The Phantom of the Opera, which was published in 1909. On May 20th, 1896, 128 years ago today, a counterweight helping to hold up the 6-ton chandelier at Charles Garnier's Paris Opera House fell into the audience during a performance of Étienne-Joseph Floquet's opera, Hellé, composed in 1779. We don't know how the opera performance was going, but the counterweight was a big hit. One woman in the audience was killed, and a number of other audience members were badly injured. The disaster was covered by a reporter for the Parisian daily Le Matin named Gaston Leroux, 1868 to 1927. The accident, to say nothing for the Paris Opera House itself and the lake beneath it, made quite an impression on Monsieur Leroux. About that underground lake, writing in the New York Times on January 24, 2023, Sam Lubell tells us that, quote, "When digging the foundations for the Paris Opera House, workers hit a hidden arm of the Seine, causing water to flood the site. It was impossible to remove all the water, so crews had to contain it with a massive concrete reservoir with a vaulted ceiling from which water is still pumped today." The so-called lake was dramatized by Gaston Leroux, author of The Phantom of the Opera, who made it the stomping grounds of the Phantom. Christopher Meade, author of Charles Garnier's Paris Opera, Architectural Empathy and the Renaissance of French Classicism, was mesmerized by the opera house. Quote, "You can see why it inspired Leroux," unquote, he said. Quote, "You could invent a whole world there," unquote. Which, of course, is precisely what Gaston Leroux did. Onwards to the star attraction of today's post. With our heads bowed, we mark the death, 128 years ago today, of the pianist and composer Clara Wieck Schumann, who died of a stroke at the age of 76 on May 20th, 1896. She was among the great pianists of her time, a child prodigy whose performances were described with awe by her adult contemporaries. She was a composer of outstanding promise who, for reasons we will discuss in tomorrow's Dr. Bob Prescribes post, never had the opportunity to fulfill that promise. She was the compositional muse for her fiancé and husband Robert Schumann, 1810 to 1856, and the spiritual muse of her best friend, Johannes Brahms, 1833 to 1897. Most of all, she was a survivor, someone whose life reads like some endlessly tragic Victorian novel, only without the happy ending tacked on at the end. No one escapes this life unscathed, but when it came to Clara, next time one of us gets into a self-pitying funk, at which I am a particular virtuoso, during which we stand convinced that our personal lives represent the very nadir of human experience, I would recommend that we think of Clara Schumann and her life as a cautionary tale, as an example of how very badly things can go if fate is not on one's side. If such reflection doesn't temper our own self-absorbed misery, frankly, nothing will. Clara Josephine Wieck was born on September 13, 1819, to Marianne Tromlitz Wieck, 1797 to 1872, and Johann Gottlob Friedrich Wieck, 1785 to 1873. Daddy was a creep, an uncompromising, relentlessly ambitious bully who brooked no interference with his plans to make his little Clara the greatest pianist of her time. He was a horror to live with. In 1824, after 8 years of marriage, Clara's mother Marianne could take no more and walked out. Under Saxon law, their 3 children were the property of the father, and so a distraught Marianne Wieck had to be satisfied with only the occasional visit and letter from her Clara. Friedrich Wieck controlled every aspect of Clara's life in his efforts to mold her into a great pianist. In this, he was singularly lucky, in that Clara's innate genius responded to his teaching. She did indeed become a great pianistic prodigy, and not, happily for Friedrich, a seething, Lizzie Borden-like monster hell-bent on her father's early and violent death. In 1828, at the age of 9, Clara met another of her father's students at a recital, an 18-year-old lapsed law student named Robert Schumann. Sadly, Wieck's pedagogic method did not work for Schumann. The 8-hours-a-day exercise regimen Wieck prescribed permanently ruined the ring finger of Schumann's right hand, destroying his future as a professional pianist, though gratefully assuring that his energies were turned to composition. Clara and Robert fell in love when she was 16 and he was 25. Friedrich Wieck behaved like a lunatic for the next 5 years in his ongoing attempts to keep them apart, but to no avail, and they were married on September 12, 1840. Clara did not know at the time of her marriage that Robert was both bipolar and syphilitic. Despite the fact that he was in his latency stage when they married, meaning that he was non-infectious and symptom-free, it remains a miracle that he didn't pass his syphilis on to her at some point as they continued to mate and make babies well into his tertiary stage. Yeah, their first child, Marie, was born in 1841. Their 8th child, Felix, named for their dearly departed friend, Felix Mendelssohn, 1809 to 1847, was born in June of 1854, 4 months after Robert's mind had snapped and he had been institutionalized. Robert's slow, excruciatingly painful descent into madness pushed Clara herself to the brink of sanity. Robert's mind went the way of 8-track cartridges on February 27, 1854, when he attempted suicide by jumping off the Dusseldorf Bridge into the Rhine River. He was rescued by a fisherman and hustled off by his doctors to an asylum. Understandably distraught, terrified, and not infrequently hysterical, Clara did not see Robert again until he lay on his deathbed in July of 1856, 2½ years later, his body destroyed and his mind rendered to that of a babbling, drooling infant by tertiary syphilis. At the time of Schumann's suicide attempt, Clara was just 34 years old. She was 5 months pregnant with her 8th child, Felix. She was, at the time, the sole breadwinner for her brood, and after the devastating years of Robert's illness and now his institutionalization, she hadn't a clue as to how she was going to survive physically, spiritually, or financially. But survive she did, largely thanks to a family friend, the 20-year-old Johannes Brahms, 1833 to 1897, who moved in with her and her children after Schumann's suicide attempt, and who for the next 2.5 years became a surrogate head of household and father to her children. Johannes Brahms and Clara Schumann fell in love with each other sometime during the fall of 1854, when he was 21 years old and she was 35. Whether they ever shared a bed, or couch, or kitchen counter, or billiards table is still unknown and will almost certainly remain so. What we do know is that Brahms ended their relationship not long after Robert's death in 1856, and that event broke Clara's now frequently broken heart. Clara's life after Robert and Johannes was terribly difficult. As a single professional mother of 8 children, living and working in the mid-18th century, she had to cope with personal and professional hardships that are well nigh unimaginable to us today. Money was an endless issue, and she had to concertize constantly to make ends meet. She was deeply conflicted about her profession versus her duties as a mother, and the guilt she felt about leaving her children for long periods of time with nannies took a heavy toll on her, psychologically and physically. The kids. To top it all off, there was the health of Clara's children, which was for her an ongoing source of agony, even before Robert's hospitalization and death. Her son Emil, born in 1846, died after 16 months. Ludwig, born in 1848, manifested symptoms of mental illness from a young age. At the age of 22, he was diagnosed as having, quote, an incurable spinal disease that presumably affected his brain, unquote. Clara wrote in her diary, quote, I have not felt such pain since the misfortune with Robert. The nights were often dreadful. For hours I would see the poor boy before me, looking at me with his good, honest eyes, unquote. On the advice of doctors, Clara committed Ludwig to an asylum in 1871. She visited him there twice, only twice, once in 1875 and then again in 1876. The poor young man begged her to take him home. But it was too much for Clara. She could not face Ludwig and the self-loathing her helplessness produced. She never saw him again after 1876, even though she lived for another 20 years and Ludwig for another 23 years. Clara's son Ferdinand, born in 1849, became a morphine addict and predeceased her by 5 years, dying at the age of 42. Felix, born in 1854, the youngest of the children and everyone's favorite, died of tuberculosis at the age of 24, predeceasing his mother by almost 18 years. Clara's daughter Julie, born in 1845, was a radiant beauty, but of delicate health. She died of tuberculosis at the age of 27, predeceasing her mother by 24 years. Well, it's no wonder Clara wore black for the bulk of her adult life. She never stopped mourning her dead. Proud and dignified, she was forced by circumstances to bear extraordinary emotional pain throughout her adult life. She suffered physical ailments as well, particularly later in her life, from debilitating joint and shoulder pain that forced her to retire from the stage. Photos of the elderly Clara Schumann reveal a face and a spirit well described by the cliché, battered but unbroken. Johannes Brahms freaks out. It was in the early 1890s that Johannes Brahms, approaching his 60th birthday, became terrified. Yes, freaked out is not too strong a phrase. That future generations were going to know more about him than he wanted them to know. So he began to recall from his friends and associates all the letters he had written them over the years, intent on destroying every blessed one of them. In no case was this more gut-wrenching than it was for Clara, who was well aware that Brahms intended to destroy all the hundreds, if not thousands, of letters he'd written to her over the years. She begged Brahms to let her save just a few of his letters, but he categorically refused. In the end, Clara returned the letters, every one of them, and this unique correspondence, a veritable 4-decade eyewitness history of Europe and European music, was consigned to the flames in Brahms's kitchen stove just like that. Destroy most of the written evidence, though he did, enough of Brahms's letters survived that we know he loved Clara. For all their ups and downs, and oh my goodness, Brahms and Clara had their ups and downs, they rarely went more than a few weeks without seeing each other. He was, as we previously observed, a surrogate father to Clara's children. He even fell in love with one of them, Clara's daughter Julie. But Brahms could never, and would never, declare his love for Julie. First, because it would have destroyed Clara, and second, because in Brahms's mind it would have been tantamount to incest. Woody Allen, he was not. Brahms suffered intensely from the illnesses and deaths of Clara's children. In particular, Felix Schumann's wasting away from tuberculosis broke his heart. In 1874, in response to Felix's declining health, Brahms wrote Clara, quote, "I feel your pain and anxiety much too deeply to be able to express it to you in words. Let this deep love of mine be a comfort to you, for I love you more than myself, and more than anybody or anything on earth," unquote. For our information, we know about this letter because Clara copied Brahms's words into her diary. Endings. Call their 43-year-long relationship what you will. It was the one true emotional anchor in both Clara's and Brahms's lives. For all of Clara's suffering, her endless moaning and sniffling and sobbing, and flashes of white-hot anger at Brahms's titanic insensitivity, they could not live in a world without each other, and each of them knew it. The news came to Brahms by telegram on May 20th, 1896, 128 years ago today, from Clara's eldest daughter, Marie. Quote, "Our mother fell gently asleep today," unquote. Clara had suffered a devastating stroke on May 16th. She lingered for 4 days, and then she died. Brahms was physically incapable of taking part in Clara's funeral procession. He hid behind some large funeral wreaths and sobbed uncontrollably. He told the violinist, Alvin von Beckeroff, quote, "Now I have nobody left to lose," unquote. He followed Clara to the grave just 10 months later, at just before 9 a.m. on April 3rd, 1897. Goodness, to have those letters. To sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses/The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.